Hello all. I'm sorry for the wait. I've been very caught up with a lot of other school stuff, but today I bring you all Unit 4 of APUSH, and another reason why this was a bit late. Also, one of the more draggy units that kind of isn't as riveting as something like the American Revolution, but I bring to you the growth and expansion of America between 1800 and 1848. So, the topics that we'll be discussing today include all the presidents during this time period: Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. Early antebellum society. I should have had that underlined because that's a very important APUSH vocab word, where pretty much just it's a term often described to discuss the time period before the Civil War. So pretty much what we're talking about right now, where personally I would range it between 1840 and 1860. And we talk about early industrialization, otherwise known as the market revolution. I personally call it early industrialization because that's just what it is. Very, very rudimentary industrial revolution, like a very rudimentary industrial like revelations and improvements. Then we'll talk about our favorite kind of term and so in a way time period to manifest destiny and general land expansion and what that meant for America. So let's begin where we left off in last video with the election of Thomas Jefferson, which his election was often referred to as the revolution of 1800. Oh, why is that there? Because of three reasons in my opinion. First is very simple. He's the first anti-federalist president, which for a streak of the first two presidents being federalist presidents, we have the first president that's supposed to kind of represent the states and the people rather than the central government body. And it was the first peaceful transition of power between the two-party system, where we have someone from the opposite party stepping into the presidential role, where with the first election and the second election, no, the first election there was contention because it was Federalists and Anti-Federalists combating over who should have that presidential role. With the second election, it was just that same party going into that role again, so Federalist to Federalist. But here we go from Federalist to Anti-Federalist peacefully. Yeah. And then the reign of the people's president. Jefferson's election is characterized by his efforts to improve America and the livelihood of the people. So those are the reasons why his election is pretty important, and other events that we'll go into. But the first thing I want to talk about kind of revolves around Jefferson and Adams, where we have the whole ordeal with the midnight judges. So, on the night that John Adams, is supposed to leave office, what he does is that he's appointing like a whole lot of Federalist judges into the Supreme Court. Now, think about why he would do this. I'll give you a second. Your second is done. So, in order to preserve federal power inside of the American government, he's stuffing the judicial branch full of Federalist judges. He's stuffing the Supreme Court full of federalism because the legislative and executive branch are all going to be under the control of Thomas Jefferson, the anti-Federalist president. So he's kind of just trying to continue pushing forward this Federalist agenda. And the whole issue of contention comes to comes to a halt, well, comes to a point in the case Marbury versus Madison. So what Marbury versus Madison states is that one of the judges from the midnight appointments isn't really supposed to be, like, he didn't get appointed into the Supreme Court despite being appointed by Adams. And um honestly, the details of the case itself, they're not as important. What's really important is the effects. So John Marshall, the leading Supreme Court justice, he puts the case in favor of Madison, who was against Marbury being a judge. But what he does is that for the short-term loss for the Federalist branch, the Federalist judicial branch, what he does is that he gives the judicial branch this power of judicial review, where what judicial review practically does is that it gives the judicial branch the ability to kind of have this ultimate say over anything in the government, where whether it be an act that the judicial branch deems unruly and they like kind of just toss it out the window, or it be anything with the president, which will it's a very strong power, a very important power that we'll see in history that we'll get back to in about 2 units in the presidency of FDR. And not even just with FDR and presidents, but generally just with acts and with the Federalist interpretation of a weak interpretation of the Constitution. That also plays a lot into things with kind of restrictions on the American citizens on war times. But I'm talking messy. Let's get back into it. Back to the present, not the present, but you know. Okay, Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. This is what he's primarily known for, which I would say wire this into your head. So, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States, duh, has a conversation with Napoleon about purchasing the Louisiana Territory, because what Jefferson wants to do is that he wants to expand the U.S. nation to become this empire of liberty, this nation that can have this global power. And Napoleon is willing to sell this huge chunk of land because Napoleon is losing his foothold in the Western Hemisphere of the world. Yeah, he's losing his foothold here because of the Haitian Revolution. Haiti was one of the French colonies, and what happens is that Toussaint Ouverture in Haiti, I probably butchered that name, but whatever. He launches the Haitian Revolution, which makes Haiti a free nation. So he's kind of losing his foothold there. And what he does is that he just sells the Louisiana Territory for a huge sum of money to Thomas Jefferson. So you might be asking, like, oh, this is such a good thing. What's the issue? Well, let's look here. Back to my little chart from the last video. Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Remember, Jefferson is an Anti-Federalist, so that means that he has a stricter interpretation of the Constitution. So he was getting a lot of heat from Federalists because they have this looser interpretation of the Constitution. So really, it would make more sense for a Federalist president to be making this purchase, because for an anti-federalist president to do that makes no sense, because nowhere in the Constitution does it necessarily state that a president can purchase land. So it's like, why would you do that? That goes against your core beliefs as an anti-federalist. And he was also getting heat from anti-federalists as well, because he's going against the values of his own party, really. Which, yeah, he's getting heat from all around. And his excuse was that he's trying to create an empire of liberty. He's trying to develop America as a nation. Let's move forward to the War of 1812 with the Jefferson and Madison presidency. So, context for this, remember, like I said in the American Revolution video, France and Britain are always in their own debacles most of the time, and this is no exception, where they're having their own conflict on the Eastern Hemisphere, but France and Britain are both trading allies to America, so when they're both fighting, that kind of leads to some contention. And the first issue comes with the impressment of American ships. Again, we saw this in the French Indian War, where the British were impressing American sailors. And again, here we see it where American trade boats and sailors are getting impressed by the British Navy forces, which again isn't really gonna rub America the right way. And the other issue that we have is the Chesapeake Leopard conflict, where two ships on the American and British side, the Chesapeake and the Leopard, kind of just get into a fight. It's simple as that, really. And that also hides tensions. And that's where we reach our breaking point here with the Embargo Acts. So, what the Embargo Act does is that it ceases all trade with Britain. And it was primarily meant to just punish the Britain for like messing with America. Like they're gonna cut off that whole resource chain. But remember, let's just think about America right now and British right now as nations. America is relatively new and they have no external connections across the globe. Like they just got out of war after war and they just had the revolution. They're a new nation. On the other hand, Britain is this long developed nation with connections all over the world. I think during this time period they even have their connections to India, and they have these many resource chains that are just coming in. So cutting off trade with Britain actually just hurts America more than anything, and we see that in this cartoon. Okay, let's look at this because you're gonna have to look at a lot of cartoons in APUSH. We have darn it the turtle next to God. He bites him in the butt. Curse this Ogrambe turtle. So I'm just gonna spell it out for you guys. Ogrambe is just embargo backwards. So this is kind of just to visualize like how the Embargo Act kind of just bit America in its own butt. You know, like it's just a visualization of that. But this is probably something you're gonna see in shortest class. I actually promise you this is something you're gonna see in shortest class. Now moving on to the actual conflicts, let's just breeze through this. The game plan here was just that Napoleon and the French forces beat Britain overseas, so they just like wiped them out on the Eastern Hemisphere, and then the American forces kind of just beat Britain on their Canadian front because Britain was coming in from Canada and they were moving into America to stop their own conflict with the Americans. Battle of Thames, 1813. Important win by Lake Erie. Yeah. Battle of Horseshoe Bends, 1814. Andrew Jackson pushes forces out of Alabama. Andrew Jackson, you know that's a president. If you don't, you're going to need to do a lot of reading. But Andrew Jackson, important president, but also sets up a trend here. Not one of the more important trends, but a trend nonetheless, where we have American presidents being previous war heroes. We see this with George Washington, and we're seeing it with Andrew Jackson here, where Jackson will later become a president. But we also see it with Rutherford B. Hayes. We see it with Zachary Taylor. We see it with Eisenhower. We see it for a lot of presidents, but not that important. Treaty of Ghent. It just ends the war, 1814. Um, more of an internal conflict move too with the Federalists. So Federalists don't really have their heads up high for this conflict. They're very certain that this conflict with Britain, who they prefer to be their ally, because remember back in the Unit 3 videos how I said that the Federalists often prefer to have Britain as their allies more than anything. So since we're kind of just going down south of Britain, and it looks like we're losing the war, the Federalists want to jump ship. They want to completely separate themselves from the American nation. And that all comes to fruition with the Hartford Convention, where the Federalists kind of come together and they're like, hey, how, like, we should separate ourselves from America. But when America won the War of 1812, that made the Federalists look like buttheads. That, like, completely ruined their reputation. And that kind of marks the end of the Federalist Party, where it's not necessarily that they like don't get a president in office for a while. The party just kind of dies out due to the like development of different parties like the Democratic Republicans, which we'll get into later. Foreign relations. So America becomes a more self-sufficient empire where we're going to get into that literally in like two, maybe one more slide with the market revolution, and Canada becomes like an official part of the British Empire. The Monroe presidency. James Monroe, not much on him, but just this cartoon. But this cartoon is super duper duper important because of the Monroe Doctrine. So, excuse me. The way I see the Monroe Doctrine is that it splits the world in two. And I feel like this document perfectly shows that because it shows Uncle Sam moving his hands out, splitting the world between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, where we have this mucky, grimy Eastern Hemisphere with Africa, Europe, and Asia, all like you can visibly see that it's much darker and less vibrant compared to the Western Hemisphere of America. And there are many reasons why Monroe did this. He did this in order to support rising democracies and to support these rising free states. We see this with the Haitians in the Haitian Revolution, where he kind of just cuts off all European ties to nations like that so that they can develop their own democracy and be free. So it's an effort to end colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. And it's also kind of an effort because remember, American history has economic undertones. It's an effort to to set up these economic relationships with rising free nations. So again, with Haiti, let's just go back to that prime example. We're gonna set up economic relationships with Haiti. We're gonna make them a market for American goods. So just to sum it up, Monroe Doctrine splits the world in two between the war-filled Eastern Hemisphere and the vibrant democratic Western Hemisphere in order to defend democracy and to establish good economic ties with everyone. Market revolution, industrial revolution, light, just very early industrialism. Travel, I'm just gonna blow through this, not super important, some of it is. But travel, turnpikes are developed, which is just like, I just think of it as mini railroads, honestly. very important for resource transportation. So we have factories being developed, steelworks, things like that. Think along that vein. And like the resource transportation is very pivotal during this time period because that's how you become self-sufficient. Because remember, we have a whole lot more land with Louisiana Purchase. We need a good way to be able to ensure that resources get everywhere so we can have the nation as a whole thriving. And then we also have steamboats with the access to new rivers through the Louisiana Purchase. Steamboats become so much more important, not only just for travel but for resource transportation again. But we also have the canal age where we're building a whole lot of canals just for trade. And the most important and huge one was the Erie Canal, which was often used as like the canal, the river, often used to just like get in and out of the nation so that we can have overseas trade with like Britain and France. Communication, just the telegraph. It was often used like with everybody in everyday life, long distance communication, self explanatory. And the Lowell Mill Girls. So in Massachusetts, we have this one factory, and it's hiring like I think purely just female workers, which think about it, very rare for the time. We didn't have much of a women's rights movement during this time period, so having a factory full of only women, like full of only female workers, was crazy revolutionary. And it wasn't like it was a crappy factory. It was a great factory. It works. It produced. It made a profit. And these women, they even went forward and had their own union. Like well, quote unquote union. It wasn't labeled a union at the time, I believe. But nonetheless, this just goes to show the success of females beyond just home life. Like how they can thrive and succeed in like in an industrial environment. And if you're snappy and quick and you have a quick brain and you know history, you may be thinking already about Rosie the Riveter from World War II. Literally the icon for female work in the industrial setting with the We Can Do It, that poster. Like something like that is kind of just an extension of what we see here with female workers kind of branching out really early on. Here just an industrial setting. But pretty much just to sum it up, like this just shows females can be successful beyond just their home lives. Slavery. So, with the industrial revolution, like the market revolution, also came developments with slavery. With the cotton gin. So, the cotton gin exponentially increased the cotton output for the South. And you would think, oh, if the cotton gin like severely improves the output of cotton, what's the need for slaves? Because you're not gonna need like it's the same input for an even greater output. That's the simplest way I can think of it. But instead of just like decreasing like the presence of slavery in the South, we have the cotton gin doing the exact opposite. Because think about it, if you have an even greater input, you have stagnant input, greater output. But if you have an even greater input, you have an exponentially better output. So that kind of just ramped it up for slavery. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Okay, moving forward, we go on to the Missouri Compromise. So, the instatement of Missouri brought a whole lot of issues because there was contention over the instatement of not only Missouri but also Maine. And this was all resolved with the Missouri Compromise, but I also want to mention the Talmadge Amendment. Because what the Talmadge Amendment kind of proposed is that slavery is abolished in one of these states. Like, there's no slavery in some of them, or, like, at the bare minimum, that, like, the state itself gets to decide what goes on there. Like, is it a free state or a slave state? You're gonna go more about this with Mistrota, but it's pretty much just an early sign of like kind of just like alluding to slavery not really being like a definite in some states, kind of just being up to decision of the state, or just like signs of slavery being abolished in some areas. But the Missouri Compromise, like the Talmadge Amendment, got scrapped because of contention from the South. Because remember, South loved their slaves, but the Missouri Compromise kind of just resolved the issue anyway. Maine would be a free state, Missouri would be a slave state, and then the southern line of the Missouri border would be this border, this boundary line of where a slave state can be, where everything beneath the line is a slave state, but everything above the line is a free state. But if you look at the line, let's look at it. If you look at this line, there are some states that it impedes on. What's this area over here? It's California. This goes right through California, which is going to bring its own issues later on in the next video. But like I said in the Unit 3 video about the American Revolution, we come to this idea of sectionalism, where the South will prioritize the South, not America as a whole. They'll prioritize the collective goals of the Southern people rather than just America as a whole, because at the end of the day, slavery that is literally exclusive to the South is what's making them money. That's what's making their lifestyle so good and awesome. And they're going to prefer that over just the well being of America. You can also kind of think of this with the Federalists in the Hartford Convention, where the Federalists are kind of just trying to protect themselves and their own party rather than just helping and protecting America as a whole. That's a decent comparison of it. Okay, corrupt bargain. The pretty much just the election of 1828, I think. So the candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. So the contention is that John Quincy Adams barely wins out the election, but that was only because Henry Clay dropped out of the election, and he went to the House of Reps, and he was like, "Hey guys, you guys gotta help me out. We gotta get John Quincy Adams in in office." And so, bam, Quincy Adams is put into office. But the issue is when Quincy Adams puts Clay as his left-hand man, really. Like, he appoints Clay on his cabinet, and all of the Jacksonians rage. The Jacksonians obviously supporters of Andrew Jackson, but all of them get super duper upset, and they say it's a corrupt bargain. That's what they deem the election. So the outrage we just discussed, but the after effects is that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay try to establish the American system, this economic system, again, just focused on tariffs and exports, but the Jacksonians protested just to like spit in the face of John Quincy Adams and contest him for such a stupid election in their eyes. And in the next election, there is heavy support for Andrew Jackson to win it, and he does win it in the next election. Spoiler alert. And then we move on to the Jacksonian presidency, characterized firstly by the Bank War. So the Bank War was conflict between Nicholas Brittle, who was the head of the national bank established by Alexander Hamilton, and it was a conflict between him and Andrew Jackson, where Andrew Jackson, who's often referred to as the hero of the common man, believed that the national bank symbolized this it symbolized the elite. It symbolized like a higher class than the common man, and that was an institution that Jackson didn't support. It was an institution that he fought to take down, and he wanted to do so by making sure that the second charter of the national bank never passed. And um ultimately, like, what Jackson does is that he uses a veto of like he uses his veto power as president to kind of just like knock the national bank out of here. And that's not something that presidents have done to this point. Like, veto use has been very exclusive, very rare. Like, Jefferson, like, he used that kind of power. Not, I'm not sure if it's necessarily a veto, but he used that level of power to get rid of something as like significant as the Alien and Sedition Acts. So that just puts into perspective like how significant the veto is, but also how it's being used for such a an issue of significantly smaller scale than what that kind of power has been used for before. So that also just paints a different picture of Jackson as sort of just this president who's more so just using his power for his own like desires and to push forward his own agenda rather than the agenda of the common man like he's claiming. And here I kind of just have this little chart to talk about like what both sides are fighting for. So Brittle is fighting for the national bank, and which he believes will cause rapid economic growth and will have more currency um into the nation. While Jackson is fighting for hard money, so use of like gold and silver notes rather than just like paper banknotes. And he's stating that this is all for like public virtue and support of the public. And although Jackson is victorious in his endeavor with the bank war, what results is a mass economic panic, which is known as the Panic of 1836. So although he won the war, it didn't really play out really well for the nation as a whole because it led to an economic like bump in the road. So then the next thing that we need to focus on with Jackson is his relationship with the Native Americans. So with lands comes issues with the Native Americans. We got a whole lot of land from the Louisiana Purchase that we wanted to explore, which we did explore. And on our conquest for this new land that we have, we had to deal with the Native Americans who are already on that land. And the way that Jackson framed the whole situation was that whatever actions they took with the Native Americans were helping an uncivilized people. And the Indian Removal Act is kind of what forced all these Native Americans off of their lands, like indefinitely, where all of them were pretty much forced into these settlement camps through the Trail of Tears, where they would have to go along this like really harsh, really brutal path to get to a settlement where they were never really satisfied. That was kind of just like bottom of the barrel. And it's not like this choice was like unanimous. There was issues with it with the court case Worcester v. Georgia, where it's kind of just saying like the Native Americans, they have no right to be displaced from their own lands, and the Supreme Court does rule in favor of that the Native Americans can't be displaced. But Jackson basically says, hey, if you want to go ahead with that decision, come and do it yourself. I'm not going to enforce that decision for you. So he's basically saying to still the current Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, you want to support that decision, come and do it yourself. So again, we're painting out Jackson in two different ways where he can be seen as like, let me just move on to the next slide. He can be seen as the hero of the common man, or he can be seen as King Andrew, who's using his power almost as a monarch to like rule over the American people. He's abusing his power of the veto. Like, I know it's really blurry, but you're gonna see this in APUSH. Like, he's holding a piece of paper that says veto, and he's abusing his power for that. And that's pretty much what you need to know about Jackson. That he's kind of just, his actions don't necessarily line up with his supposed beliefs for America. Sorry, moving back because I missed one point. The Carlisle Indian School is where some of these Native Americans were taken to kind of assimilate into American culture. Assimilation, I'm very sure you guys are familiar with, where Native Americans were kind of forced to adopt American culture and abandon their own Native American heritage and culture. And that's kind of something that we see replicated later on in history with imperialism, but that's a conversation for another day. Now we move on to like the antebellum era, what I consider to be the events that occur, like the significant events that occur in this time period with the antebellum era, where we have all you guys have to recognize this document. It's Manifest Destiny, of course, and this document really is just encapsulating everything that Manifest Destiny holds, where we have this angelic figure holding the Bible, presumably, leading the charge of the American people forward onto onto the Native American lands, leading all of them forward towards this new discovery, this new lands that they're going to take over. And like I said earlier, Louisiana purchased a lot more land for America, and it was seen as their God-given right to go coast to coast and conquer all of the continent. And there was, besides just a religious standpoint on Manifest Destiny, there was an economic standpoint where more lands means more natural resources, more materials for industrialization, where getting more materials will only continue to boost America and their influence and power on a global stage. And the final thing that I want to talk about here is this developing sense of nativism for Native Americans. Nativism is kind of just like it's sort of like you're discriminating against this group of people just because like, oh, they're Native American, just because like stereotypes. So just like in a sense it is racism. But yeah, but that's something that we're going to talk about in the next video, or maybe in the next video, when we go into the immigration wave that occurs during this time period where nativism is really shown with the Irish. But just to wrap up this very iffy unit, we have transcendentalism, where this is kind of a new religious standpoint to hold during this time period where you're it's a focus on individualism and you're rejecting materialism. And the kind of leader for this movement was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Brook Farm was this kind of sort of like like not like simulation, but just like a scenario where a whole lot of people were kind of isolated at Brook Farm, and they were told how to live their lives, what to do, how to progress, how to live how to like adopt a certain lifestyle that was supposed to lead them to this utopia, that was supposed to lead them toward like a utopian society. And if like the Brook Farm was successful, it would be like the first step, like the first stage to achieving like a utopian society in America. Like, but Brook Farm failed due to like riots over like I believe it was like the division of resources, but that's besides the point. Just note Brook Farm when thinking about transcendentalism and how it was a failed effort. It kind of showed the flaws in this kind of thinking, but and not the kind of thinking, but just like the approach and just like the actions that some transcendentalists took. But that wraps up this video and this unit. Next unit will be a lot better with the Civil War and with Reconstruction. And I will see you guys then. Goodbye.